This is Spain. And this is Galicia, Spain's northwesternmost province, scene of the greatest adventure of our lives. Galicia's misty green hills are more Irish than Latin. It was the Celtic tribes from Ireland and Scotland, in fact, who first settled here in the 3rd century BC. Their descendants live in these quaint whitewashed houses which nestle around the fine bays and harbors like relics out of the 18th century. You can still see Ireland in their faces and in their hearts. Galicia owes its existence to the sea. Sardine fishing is the main source of its meager income. And the women must work side by side with the men in the constant struggle for survival in a primitive society. But the part of Galicia which concerns us is the Bay of Vigo, just 12 miles north of Portugal. For here lies over $115 million in Spanish gold and silver. The treasure story begins in 1699. Angry because the Frenchman, Philip V, sat on the throne of Spain, Britain and Holland declared war and blockaded the return of Spain's annual treasure fleet from America. But after 3 years, Spain was destitute. She needed money to fight her war. So Philip ordered his treasure fleet home in spite of the dangers. En route, the fleet was ordered to hide in Vigo Bay and await orders regarding the treasure. So the ships took up stations deep inside the harbor, fortified the narrow banks with ships' cannons, and blocked the entrance with a floating chain of tree trunks. But a British spy soon discovered their whereabouts. The result was one of the greatest massacres in naval history. The entire treasure fleet was lost or captured, and so was the world's richest sunken treasure. Since then, generations of treasure seekers have assaulted the peaceful waters of Vigo Bay with all kinds of diving equipment. The leader of our expedition was John S. Potter. He was so convinced that new diving techniques could find and raise the treasure that he offered the Spanish government 50% for permission to try. The research alone required 2 full years. It led him through the archives of Paris, Madrid, London, and Amsterdam, and through 15,000 pages of history books, salvage reports, and ancient ship's logs. And financing the treasure hunt was a job in itself. Over $100,000 would be needed. It required super salesmanship and super patience to get it. Finally, he hired us to help him find it. We were John Nathan from San Francisco, California, Robert Stenweave, Belgium's famous man under the sea from Brussels, Yves Pierre from Paris, France, and myself, Owen Lee, from St. Louis, Missouri. Potter couldn't afford to pay high salaries. We would get expenses, plus a share in the treasure. Our first job as treasure divers was to find and outfit a good diving boat. In primitive Galicia, this wasn't easy. The best we could do was an old sand barge, and it was powered by one of the first diesel engines ever built. You had to cook it with a blowtorch to get it to go. God guard you, proclaimed our mighty ship, but the uncertain throb of her engine made us dubious. I am the captain of this ship, it seemed to be saying. I am the master of its fate. From John Potter's research, we knew pretty well the general area where the Spanish galleons had sunk. Local fishermen provided the rest. Here, they said, is where we snag our fishing nets. We went down to investigate. We all knew what a galleon looked like on the surface, but what did one look like after 2.5 centuries on the bottom of the bay? We soon found out. There were the ribs of our galleon protruding through the muddy bottom. They were covered with beautiful pink sea anemones. Look at the heavy planks where they joined with the ribs. Within a month, we found 6 more such wrecks. But in most cases, an oddly shaped mass was all that remained. For anything that wasn't buried in the mud was quickly eaten away. We chose the most promising of the 7 wrecks and began to search it. To determine exactly how and where the wreck lay beneath the mud, we took hundreds of probes with a long steel rod. Whenever the rod hit something solid beneath the mud, we released a small hand buoy to the surface. Thus, we drew an outline of the ship on the surface as she lay on the bottom. Next, we explored the area inside the buoys with an underwater metal detector. Whenever the detector passed over metal, it registered on the surface, and the detector man in a boat would throw a buoy over the side. There was evidence of metal all over the place. We chugged happily back to shore, convinced that we would all be millionaires within a month. On the way home, we stopped off at a Galician snack bar to celebrate with some local fare. Boiled octopus. There was only one way to tell if the metal detector had found gold, silver, or an empty sardine can. Bring it up. So we returned to the wreck with an underwater vacuum sweeper called an airlift. The suction head of our airlift was fed a constant volume of air from this compressor in our boat. As the air bubbled upward inside the hose, it created a vacuum which sucked in the mud and spilled it into a wire crib on the surface. But as we dug down through the mud, the walls of the hole began to cave in on top of our divers. So we lowered a huge metal tube which would act like a cofferdam. Clogged intake was also dangerous. But then air accumulated inside and the hose would shoot for the surface, diver and all. These quick trips to the surface often caused bloody noses, which became our worst occupational hazard. Nevertheless, we proceeded to clear away the centuries of mud and silt that had settled over our wreck. Then we found what we were looking for. There were several oddly shaped masses that were heavily encrusted. Our crewmen chipped away the incrustation. And they turned out to be cannonballs. That day we found over 100 of them. Our next find was even more spectacular. The magnetic detector indicated that it was a huge mass of metal. Took everything we could muster to lift it. And it turned out to be a cannon. One cannon seemed to lead to another. And before long, our deck was covered with them, each one weighing in at 2,500 pounds. Even Mother Nature seemed to be on our side here. For the cannon were covered with wild oysters. Delicious. After 8 months, we unloaded the results of our work at Vigo Bay. We called in Father Perez, a naval historian, to help us evaluate our findings, but he was anything but encouraging. He told us that these cannons were rejects that had been carried in the bottom of the ship with the stones as extra ballast. These timbers, he said, were part of the keelson from the very bottom. You could still see the notches in the wooden pegs that held the pieces together. The cannonballs and cannon indicated that this wreck was not a cargo galleon at all, but a warship. 8 months of work for nothing. This called for new strategy. We couldn't afford to spend 8 months cleaning each wreck. Heavy dredging equipment could do it in no time, but who could afford it? On the other hand, there was one galleon we knew had 300 tons of silver aboard. The log of an English ship told us that it had been captured by the British, loaded with treasure, and then taken away as a prize. But as the log further explained,
the English pilots, being unfamiliar with the coast, let the galleon hit a rock where it bulged and sank immediately.
We figured the sunken rock was the one called Los Castros. Finding Los Castros took days of sounding with a lead line. But no matter, without the freedom provided by new scuba diving equipment, no diver would have dared to search the area before. For the rock lay in deep and treacherous currents 10 miles from shore to the Cius Islands. After finding the rock, we moved our headquarters to a tiny fishing village that was closer to the islands. Meanwhile, we laid 200-yard-long search lines at 5-degree angles all around the rock. Using the currents, angle by angle, we searched the rock. Here, at last, the water was clear. Each dive was like a visit to another planet. Dreamlike and weightless, we soared through liquid space like birds in the sky. And for the first time, we became aware of the other creatures whose habitat we shared. But day after day, week after week, our lost galleon eluded us. After a futile search, we would return to the boat not quite believing that our treasure ship ever existed. Then new research proved that Spanish galleons didn't draw enough depth to have ever hit this rock. This meant that there was only one other rock in the area that was shallow enough, Carameros. Our mistake had cost us dearly. But at Carameros, we hit pay dirt immediately. We discovered a big cannon on our very first dive there. Here it is in its underwater camouflage. The ship's timber. And the rock itself seemed littered with cannonballs. Then, treasure at last. It looked like a chocolate cupcake when we brought it up. But when we had chipped away the incrustation, we knew we had found our first silver coin. An archaeologist suggested a bath of muriatic acid to clean it. We tried it. It worked perfectly. A Spanish piece of 8, dated 1699. Word of our discovery spread like fire. The next day, the Spanish Navy was on hand to protect their government's 50% interest in the treasure. But as if by design, just as suddenly as they had appeared, so did any further sign of our galleon disappear. Superstitiously, we blamed them for a bad turn of luck. They, in turn, accused us of concealing the treasure. Suddenly, everything seemed to have gone wrong. The sky seemed gray in spite of the bright sunshine. The anchor seemed heavier as we heaved on the lines to head for shore. Even our faithful Jeep became disenchanted. There was only one possible explanation. After hitting the rock, the galleon must have drifted free with the rising tide. So we began a new search pattern involving two buoys set 100 yards apart, and then swimming 200 yards due south with the currents at regular 10-yard intervals. Meanwhile, we decided to enlist the aid of local fishermen. We printed handbills offering rewards of 30,000 pesetas, about $500, to anyone who could lead us to our lost galleon. There was a lot of interest, but no results, until one day our own boatman told us about an old eel fisherman named Fernandez. He was known to fish at night over a wreck that he alone could find. Where does he live, we asked, but our sailor didn't know. We began an intensive search for a fisherman named Fernandez. Not a man or woman in the area was spared our questions. Finally, we found one in the local bar. Hola. Buscando un señor que se llama Fernandez. Claro, hombre. Aquí hay un Fernandez. Buenas. Somos para el señor quien pesca solo a las noches cerca de las Islas Cías. It turned out he was a Fernandez all right, but not the one we wanted. And it seemed that he had 20 uncles and dozens of cousins in the area, all by the same name. We split forces, and each of us took a list of Fernandezes to track down. But the list, instead of becoming smaller, became bigger and bigger. Before long, we had traced the family tree from top to roots and unearthed untold generations of people, all called Fernandez. Nevertheless, our persistence paid off. One day, a little girl led us to the home of a Pedro Fernandez. Was he an eel fisherman, we asked his wife. Yes, his wife answered. Did he fish alone at night on a wreck near the Cías Islands? Yes, his wife answered. Could we please see him? No, his wife answered. It seemed that Pedro was sick. We would have to wait. After 3 days, we returned to the house, eager to question our lone fisherman. Our friend here was trying to say something. Yes, Pedro Fernandez had gone forever. And with him, he had taken the secret location of our lost treasure galleon. By this time, we all owed so much money that we couldn't leave town even if we had wanted to. So hopefully, we continued our search. Because of the extreme depth we were now working in, we became more cautious. Our mouthpieces, for example, were strapped on as a precaution against nitrogen narcosis, that sort of deep-water drunk that comes from breathing air under great pressure. Each of us carried a heavy trident-like tool called the Nathan rod. It could be used as a knife, a hook, a probe, a shark belly, a buoy anchor, and a weight substitute that could be easily dropped for quick ascents in case of emergencies. And there was always the comforting thought of our boatmen who followed the bubbles on the surface. Still, nothing was found, and our search area grew bigger each day, until at last we came to the flat, sandy bottom of the continental shelf where nothing could hide. Here, the bottom was so deep that visual searching with divers was impractical. But if the bottom were really flat, any wreck would show up on an echo sounder. So we used our underwater sled to check the bottom. Towed 600 feet behind our boat, we knifed through water over 200 feet in depth and covered a full mile on each dive. The bottom was flat, all right. Flat as a pancake. As a result, John Potter rented a big fishing boat that was fully equipped with electronic search gear. And early one morning, we rendezvoused our entire crew to begin a last-ditch effort to find the treasure. The plan was simple. The electronic search boat would travel back and forth over an imaginary grid on the search area. If it found something, it would toot its horn and drop a buoy overboard. Then our own boat would come to send a diver down, and he would find the treasure. So, we began our search. As our search boat passed back and forth over the imaginary grid, a man stood by on the stern, ready to throw a buoy overboard. Meanwhile, our diving boat hove to, ready to send a diver down to investigate. Back and forth we went, with our eyes glued to the echo sounder. Day in and day out. But nothing so much as a fish showed up. Then one day, over the side went the Morse report. Our search boat couldn't stop without losing its position in the search pattern. Now it was up to the divers. Almost 4 years had passed since we had begun our search for the treasure of Vigo Bay. Over $100,000 had been spent in the process. Perhaps millions in gold and silver awaited us just beneath that marker buoy. Was this the fateful day we had all waited for? The diver carried a stone to hasten his descent. At 180 feet, he reached the bottom. He tied a long search line to the buoy anchor and began to swim in ever-widening circles around the anchor. Then he found what had caused the signal. Anxiously, we waited on the surface. Yes, there were the familiar ribs of a wooden ship after many years on the bottom. And some of the planking was still intact. So we had cause to celebrate again. Well, now you ask, well, what did we find in Vigo Bay? for our 4 years of back-breaking effort and our cost of over $100,000. Well, this is all I got. One single solitary silver piece of eight. Oh, that wreck we found, it turned out to be an old fishing boat less than 100 years old. But maybe one day I'll go back and find the rest of it, because it's there. It's a fact of history. And as Joseph Conrad, that great writer of the sea, once said, there's no escaping a treasure once it gets into a man's blood. He either finds it or he dies looking for it.